Faith in a Modern World, Lent Study Group 2016.
Part 2, Environment and Ethics. In today's world, we're all painfully aware of the tremendous gap between rich and poor. Charities, or NGOs as we're now required to call them, do great work. But articulate people from the poorer countries tell us they want justice, not charity. How should we respond to this cry from the heart? John Polkinghorne.
Well, I think it's a very reasonable plea to make. The best aid, I think, is recognised, is an aid that enables people in the short to medium term to help themselves. It doesn't just give them a handout, it digs them a well or something like that. It gives them a longer term prospect.
Pauline Webb picks up on this. She starts with the Old Testament and illustrates from personal experience.
The cry of the prophets, isn't it, really, right from the Old Testament onwards, and the Lord requires justice. We were never asked just to give alms. Charity can be a very demeaning thing. I've been on the giving end of charity, literally, to hungry people, been in a famine relief village in India, and I felt humiliated by it. I felt that doling out bowls of rice to people and not allowing them to have more than one bowl because they'd already had one bowl, and they're being grateful, I found that humiliating. So obviously, one bowl of rice is better than nothing.
Rowan Williams spells out the urgency which underlies this question.
I don't think anybody starts with an agenda saying, oh, let's make poor people poorer. But people say, well, on the whole, the way we work benefits the largest number of people, and sooner or later the poorer countries will feel the benefits of this. And I think you can get into a mindset which believes that that's all there is to be said. But I think it is a dangerous illusion, because the length of time it takes for any imaginable economic benefit to penetrate is long enough for several million people to die en route. So I don't think that'll quite do.
A famous British adage tells us that charity begins at home. Does it? And if so, where does it end? Joel Edwards, followed by John Polkinghorne.
Yes, I guess it does. But the inference is it doesn't stop there. I think if you can't be charitable in your own house, you're in real trouble elsewhere. So it's very easy for us to talk about the poor elsewhere. The faraway poor can be very easy. Distended stomachs of African children with flies is a very emotive picture. The fact that we still have, 2.5 million children in the United Kingdom who live below the poverty line. And I know once again we can play statistical games with that. There are still poor people in the UK. And so once again, we have to apply the same rules, acting on behalf of the poor, supporting charities who work with the poor, offering ourselves as voluntary workers in the interest of the poor. Has to start at home in order to be credible abroad.
Well, I think it's a realistic saying. I think that people don't care and have compassion for those who are nearest and dearest to them. It's very unlikely that they will really care for people who are very, very far away. So I think there is a sense in which charity does begin at home, but it can't simply stop at home. I mean, we are immensely rich. Even the most deprived person in the British Isles is immensely rich in world terms. And clearly, we have a responsibility to try and do what we can for other nations. Again, to try and do that in a way that's constructive and not just handouts that keep people in sort of beggary, really.
And what do Pauline Webb and Rowan Williams make of that adage?
Well, where is home? It's wherever there's need. This is God's world, this is our home, and the child in India who's hungry is as important to us as the child in the East End of London who's hungry.
Charity begins at home is a statement which I think I can endorse, in the sense that it means if I can't love the people that I can see, then it's not much good trying to love the people on the other side of the world. And in one of the great meditations on this at the beginning of the English Reformation, William Tyndale, the Bible translator, says, well, of course, you have clear duties to those who are closest to you, those you can see, those whose needs are immediate and pressing. And then he says, when you've dealt with that, remember you owe the same thing to those you can't see, those over the horizon. And the debt is the same, your debt, not theirs.
The war against terrorism is a phrase that's come into our language since September the 11th, 2001. The inventor of that phrase was President George W. Bush, who also said, to create a safer world, you have to create a better world. What do our team make of that? Pauline Webb and Rowan Williams, followed by John Polkinghorne.
Why do terrorists get such support? It's because the things they're fighting for seem just to some people. When you think how people who were once called terrorists eventually become admired. I mean, I can remember when Nelson Mandela was called a terrorist because he was trying by force to bring about a change in society. But now people see that the changes he was calling for were justified, and eventually, of course, by much more peaceful methods, that aim was achieved. I don't think war is ever justified, but I think the attempt to restrain terrorists and the attempt to so create just conditions that they can't in fact operate is much more important.
It's too simple to say that poverty causes terrorism. People still make decisions, and some people make wicked decisions, and terrorism is that. But what is the soil on which that grows, and what is it that makes so many otherwise reasonable and humane people collude with terrorism? All those very decent middle-class Palestinians who were prepared to turn a blind eye to suicide bombers. What makes them do that? The answer is helplessness, powerlessness.
Dispossess people who feel an injustice has been done to them, they've been deprived of what is their reasonable rights, are going to be hotbeds for discontent for terrorism. And that long-term solutions must require some just addressing of their problems, as well as the repression of those who are seeking violence.
The modern world is fast-moving and fast-changing. Every week, advances in science and technology throw up new ethical questions. GM crops, global warming, artificial insemination, surrogate mothers, and a host of others. Can we turn to the Bible and Christian tradition for help? Does ancient wisdom cut any ice in the modern world? Joel Edwards, John Polkinghorne, and Pauline Webb.
What the Bible gives us is a framework of creation, and I think that's the starting point. And I think if we begin from a creation position, God made this world, we have a responsibility to sustain this world, then that's the context in which we deal with issues of justice, issues of productivity.
And one of the most important principles is that the land, for example, in the Old Testament, the land belongs to God. It doesn't belong to the people of Israel who have occupied it, and that's why they have the system of Jubilee, that after a period of time you have to hand it all back again. And those are principles that I think we need to take very seriously, and the respect for creation, that the world is not just there to be ravaged for our benefit. So there are some general principles, but how you work them out in particular cases are very complicated and require very careful thinking, and involve, I think, people of ethical goodwill, whether they're from a religious background or not.
I think it's interesting that the Bible teaches us that you do have to look at the issues of your time and ask what this demands of you in terms of what God requires of you. You know, Micah's thing, what does the Lord require? But that you do justly, love mercy, and walk humbly with your God. Now, in the biblical times, they applied these principles to issues of their day. I mean, even things like dietary rules. The principle that you have to ask whether this is the right way to treat your body, whether this is the right way to revere God's creation, are the same fundamental questions that are asked in the Bible.
Rowan Williams takes us in a surprising direction.
I'd want to go back here, I think, to the sense that Christianity and, of course, Judaism have a particular vision of humanity. What's humanity created for? Well, it's created for the worship and service of Almighty God. And because of that, what matters most in human life is what allows people to grow into the freedom that they require to give God the worship and the service that God asks. I think also for the Christian, there's a very, very deep perspective which says we're involved in the Christian church because of God's invitation, and that invitation is extended equally to all of us, so we learn to see one another as guests, not as people who've earned a place, but as people invited. And that, I think, does have a really transforming effect on our ethics, if we take it all the way through.
And now over to David Coffey for his summary.
We've been listening on this tape to John Polkinghorne, an Anglican minister and distinguished theoretical physicist. John will tell you that the life of our world is doomed, though whether through the big crunch or the big freeze, no one can tell. The urgent question we have to face is whether as human beings we will hasten the end of our world by our foolishness and greed. As Christians, we need to take very seriously our stewardship of God's beautiful, robust, but alas, not indestructible world. T.S. Eliot's words are a stark warning regarding responsible stewardship. This is the way the world ends. This is the way the world ends. This is the way the world ends, not with a bang, but with a whimper. Now, if you find that unduly pessimistic, let me remind you that the Bible hopefully talks about a new creation, a new heaven and a new earth. However we care for our world, God has planned for his creation a glorious destiny. And as God's co-workers, we need to carry this hope in our hearts. Kahlil Gibran has something of this new world order. For what is it to die, but to stand naked in the wind and melt in the sun? And what is it to cease breathing, but to free the breath from its restless tides, that it may seek God unencumbered? Only when you drink from the river of silence shall you indeed see. And when you have reached the mountain top, then you shall begin to climb. And when the earth shall claim your limbs, then shall you truly dance.